Well, good morning in the afternoon, everyone. It's Brian Link. It's been a while since I did a video. Partly it's my schedule, get a little tired and it's hard to do. Also, I'm watching the views of how many people watch what videos and whatnot. And while I enjoy doing the drive-through Bible, and I'm going to continue to do that, part of what I want to do is talk about media and culture and like how do we change the world, make it a better place, and all those utopian ideas. I don't know if you want to call it the swamp, the New World Order, or whatever, the progressives. Um, you know, they, for a long time, have tried to change the world. And progressively, they have moved it forward to what they think it should be by getting control of business, media, entertainment companies, the education, high school, college, even elementary. And they have gradually tried to put into culture things they think how it should be. And I founded RWNB, which is technically not a real company yet because it's more of an idea, but with the idea of taking back the culture and kind of old-fashioned values and whatnot. So I debated what I should do with this video. I'm still kind of new to the whole YouTube thing, and I did a thing on the Twin Cities media or radio history, and this is going to be kind of a part 2. Mostly just kind of helps give me experience and get out some knowledge I have, because it does play a role in, well, one, it's helping me kind of, get more experience doing videos, but taking back the culture through media is part of what I'd like to see happen. And I think understanding the history of media and where we're going is a part of that. Now, does everybody need to know every little detail I remember? No. But, I'm going to rewind a little bit in history. Radio has a commercial entity, basically started in 1923. Now, depending upon who you ask and what details you read, radio, basically it's tied with the invention of the telephone and the telegraph and the recording and playback, like the Victrola, which is basically a record player, just a little different technology, if you will. So all that kind of came out in one ball of wax, let's just call it. And so people have been experimenting with radio back in before World War I, which for the United States was 1914 to 1918. And then after the war was over, the Navy briefly took control of all radio because they thought it was a good idea. Congress didn't and made them give back everything they took. And in basically 21, 22, radio stations started operating, and the basically what's now on streaming called FAST, free ad-supported television, or FOSSR, free ad-supported radio, is what really got started and what made broadcasting possible. The idea for television was around for about as long as radio. It just didn't come into commercial success until basically the 1950s after World War II. And, the whole cable television industry didn't start as a commercial entity until, the early pioneers were in the 70s, but the cable that, I'm 46. So people who are at least 30 before all the cord cutting happened remember, cable from way back when. When I first got cable, when I was like 8 years old or whatever, obviously my mom was paying the bill, but you know what I mean. The cable systems with the coaxial cables was limited to about 60 channels, and they rebroadcast the local TV stations, and depending upon your area, that would have been about 10. Depending upon your state and area, there would have been like public access channels. There was some home shopping type channels that existed, and like C-SPAN, public affairs type channels. So, I mean, when you look at all of that, there was about 30 channels, maybe 40, left for commercial broadcasting. Now, HBO and Showtime, obviously, they were paid services, so they took up some of the spectrum. So you had, maybe 30 spots for independent, we'll call them broadcasters, even though they're not broadcasting over the air. They were cable broadcasters, cable networks. To exist. Now, eventually in the 90s, digital cable with the fiber optic cable expanded that channel lineup, and we went from about 60 to about 300. And now with the media industry kind of collapsing and changing with streaming and how the technology, I think part of the problem is the technology has changed so fast, where we go from radio to TV to cable to internet in such a short time frame. And I think there are advantages of all forms of media, but people, there's only so many people in this country. Whatever the current exact number is, it's 350 million people, give or take. And if that's your marketplace, just forget the rest of the world for a second. Obviously, the English-speaking world, which is a fair amount of the world, counting second language and whatnot, can get Hollywood movies and TV shows and enjoy them. And a lot of it's dubbed into other languages, including Spanish and whatnot. But, okay, so focusing on the United States as the market, let's just keep it simple and say there's 300 million people, and that translates into about 100 million households. So, if you, in the original days of TV, and even radio for that matter, you only had one TV. It's not like you had multiple TVs in every room and multiple devices where you could effectively watch TV anytime or any way you wanted. So there was a limited number of, the dad could watch so many hours, mom could watch so many hours, kids could watch so many hours, grandparents could watch so many hours. And with, before cable, from the 50s to the 80s, television basically consisted of 3 or 4 channels on your local TV. The VHF dial, which is channels 2 through 13, came into being, and technically a little longer than this, but as far as mainstream acceptance and commercial purposes, basically the VHF dial, as we know it, channels 2 through 13, took effect in about 47 or 48, and then the UHF channels 14 through, originally it was 83, that took effect a little later. I don't know the exact, and same with AM. AM was first, and then FM came later. Well, back in the 60s, basically, is when UHF kind of first appeared, and it wasn't really commercially successful for the most part until the 80s. Same with FM radio. FM radio showed up in the 60s, but really wasn't commercially successful until the 80s. Now, I'm oversimplifying this just to, make some general points, but, you get the idea that we had expanded choices from, let's just say, 1970 as a mile marker forward, because, cable and satellite started to become an option at that point as well. The internet with video as we know it really didn't occur until, 2005, 2006. Even then it was a bumpy start. It wasn't really mainstream accessible and commercially profitable. You could argue it's still not commercially profitable for many, but that aside, wasn't even profitable until like 2010 or so. And, so we went from, in a short time frame, a lot of things changed. And so I've always been of the argument that, there's limited eyeballs, there's limited bandwidth. Now, with the internet, almost anybody can put their stuff up, but to get enough of a, audience, to get enough views, clicks, likes, whatever the case may be with social media, it's not easy. Now, there are breakthrough exceptions, but with FM, which is my main passion, radio, I would like to see, okay, TV. I need to address this. They cut back the number of available TV channels from 2 to 83. Originally, they cut it back to 60, 2 to 69, and then later 2 to 51, and now it's 2 to 36. Channel 1 doesn't work because there's some technical issues that I won't get into. But so we got basically 35 possible channels that broadcasters can use, and there's a space issue with how many channels you can put close together and where the market is and whatnot. With digital TV, those things are a little more flexible than with the other analog TV that we had prior. But, we have a limited amount of choices, and they're shrinking it down, and to some degree that's good, because too many competitors, it's just like we're seeing with streaming wars. It's hard to compete. Well, my idea many years ago was, TV is getting so expensive to produce, and this was before cell phones and YouTube and whatnot. My argument was it's so expensive to produce, what if we started doing more radio? Now, HD radio does exist, but it's still not really commercially viable for the most part. Most people don't know what it is. The listenership, the choices, etc. are not quite developed. But I thought, well, couldn't we as Christians and conservatives and people who care about, original, make America great, family values and all that. And look, if you're not a Republican, that's fine. I'm just saying, I think there's a lot of good things that happened in this country. There's bad things too, but there's a lot of good things that happened in this country. And if we look back at our history, I think we should celebrate what's good and learn from what's bad and try and move forward together as one harmonious people group. Okay, so the radio dial. Basically, in the United States, there's 92.1 megahertz up until 107.9 megahertz is the FM commercial band. Now, not addressing HD at all for a second. The way the spacing works is basically every 5 digits, and there's only odd numbers. So 92.1, 92.3, 92.5, etc. The numbers 88.1 up until 91.9, those frequencies are reserved for non-commercial broadcasters, and the rules for what you can do as far as selling ads and whatnot are very different. And there's also differences in, they can squeeze a few more stations in there than you can with the commercial band. But with the commercial band, if there's a station at 92.1, the next available frequency in the same area at full power would be 92.9, because they space it out so different communities can have stations and they don't interfere with each other and whatnot. And then from 92.9, the next would be 93.7. And unless you're in like New York or Los Angeles, where there's a station every other frequency, so, there's, and without looking, I don't know what the dial is exactly, but for sake of argument, there's a commercial station at 92.1, there's another commercial station at 92.5, there's another commercial station at 92.9, all the way up to 107.9, and the reason that is the way the spacing is. Now, it depends upon the size of the station and some details, but an oversimplification of the spacing rules is basically a full power station, depending upon where you are in the country, is either 50,000 watts or 100,000 watts. Basically, on the coast, like New York and California, the limit is 50,000 and they can be spaced closer together. Because of that, in the Great Expanse in the middle, where the population is less dense, the limit is 100,000 and they need to be spaced a little further apart. Because of that, simply put, a full power station at 100,000 watts has to be, and this gets iffy, but I'm trying to oversimplify it so you can all get the basic idea. Around 150 miles between full power stations on the same frequency. So again, if you've got 92.1 has the radio station you own, somebody else has to be at least 150 miles away before they can have another station that they own on that same 92.1. Now, it's about 100 miles to be on 92.3 or 92.5. So the first adjacent and second adjacent stations basically the same. And then when you go to 91 or 92.7, then it's like a 50-mile radius, assuming there isn't another full power station on 92. Anyways, again, it gets complicated, and I'm trying to do this a lot from memory, but basically, you have to have stations spaced apart. Now, you go through the dial, and there's some translator stations, which is a different classification, and they can be on the frequencies in between. In days gone by, say if you lived in Minneapolis, you might hear, like, okay, for instance, 94.5 KSTP, major Twin Cities station, and the next station down, which I talked about in another video, is 93.7, and that in between there, 94.1, I believe that there's a station in St. Cloud on 94.1. There might also be in Mankato. Again, it's hard for me to remember all the details, but so you used to be able to pick up distant stations that would come in. But then with translators, the law, they're only allowed to operate at 250 watts, and now there's also these low power FMs, which are allowed to only be 100 watts. So we're talking from 100 watts to 100,000 watts. I mean, literally, a huge difference. We're talking 10, oh boy, my math right now. Okay, I could rabbit trail into details, but we're talking about a huge power difference. So there's stations that exist, and generally in between 92 and the end of and 108, there's basically room for 20 commercial stations, assuming everything is spaced out. Now, if you get short spacing where they have a station, like they do in California and New York, because the radio real estate is so valuable, you're going to get certain stations broadcasting from like the south of the metro, other stations broadcasting from the north of the metro, and they figured out a way to tweak it by getting other stations to move and whatnot. And so everything is possible if there's enough audience and enough money, and in New York and LA and probably Chicago, that is the case. So what happens, like with the ratings, you've got generally the full power, that's 100,000 watt for most of the country. FM stations are the ones that get most of the ratings. Some AM stations still get some good ratings, but they're few and far between. Some of the lower power, they call them pea shooters or rim shots, that might be in a smaller power radius from a distant community, they tend to get less ratings. And there are exceptions, but generally speaking, that is the nature of the beast. And obviously, the more ratings you get, the more people that are listening, the more ads the higher dollar amount you can sell your ads for. And that's kind of part of what the streaming wars is dealing with, is the market is so oversaturated with potential places to advertise with all sorts of online everything. So I think it's still possible. But I did want to talk a little bit about radio history and some of the stations in the Twin Cities because, one, I'm a geek. Two, this gives me a little more experience. But three, I want to harken back to a simpler time, and maybe eventually we can get back there, maybe partly using HD radio. I'm a big fan and proponent of HD radio and what it could mean with more stations broadcasting in a smaller spectrum and whatnot. I won't get into all the techs of that now, but okay. In the Twin Cities, I mean, we talked a lot about KQRS. The current classic rock format of KQRS started, I believe, it was in like 1983 or 84, and then Tom Bernard started in, I believe, was 85, and that was and we'll deal with the non-profit stations later. And that was originally on AM 1440, KQRS, and the KQRS FM and KQRS AM at one point had different formats. And, 1440 is no longer owned by the people who own KQRS. But, I mean, there's a story there. In the Twin Cities, AM 1280 had been many different formats. And then in the late 80s, early 90s, a company called Radio Oz bought AM 1280 WWTC, which is currently the Patriot Political Talk from Salem. But they had children's music and children's programming, and it was pretty popular. And they even had a contract with Disney. And there's this big lawsuit you can look up if you look up Radio Disney on probably Wikipedia and other places. But, they were doing something different. And they actually had a network built out of their Minneapolis station that went, so many affiliates across the country. And then Disney got jealous and wanted to compete. That sounds familiar. Streaming Netflix. Interesting. Buying out Fox. Interesting. So they had AM 1440, which was KQRS, also a simulcast. And, back at one point, before it was the stations for KQRS, those call letters, it was Adam and Eve. And I don't know if Adam was on the FM side. I think Eve was AM 1440 and Adam was FM 92.5, and like two different variations of oldies stations and whatnot before their current. Anyways, so, and of course, so there's a story where Radio Oz didn't survive because Disney came in and canceled their contracts and overcompeted, and Radio Disney doesn't even exist anymore because the market is changing so much. 93.7, we talked a lot about 93X and that, so I'll move on. 94.5 is KS95. The Hubbards owned that. The FM station was formed somewhere in the 60s, but KSTP TV, KSTP AM, both were formed. KSTP AM, I believe, was 1927 when two Twin City stations merged to form what is now AM 1500 KSTP, currently airing a sports talk format. But they 94.5 is what's called Hot AC, Hot Adult Contemporary. So unlike the CHR or Contemporary Hit Radio or Top 40 format, Hot AC is meant to have a little bigger selection and geared more towards adults, where the CHR, the the top 40 tends to be more children oriented, and by children I really mean teens and 20 somethings, and they play whatever's hot, but there's the rap and some of the stuff that maybe some older listeners don't want to listen to. So that's kind of the difference between hot AC and top 40 or CHR. There's also a few other variations, but keep it simple right now. So yeah, and in the 60s when KSTP FM started, they've been playing basically the same format for the last 50, 60 years, whatever exactly. I'm sure they tweaked it over the years. I remember a few different changes as time has went on, but they've been mostly live and local, and they're a big ratings getter because of that. 95.3 has an interesting history. It's a smaller station with a smaller reach because when it was founded, it didn't expand its signal, and there's other signals that got in the way of its signal being bigger. But 95.3 is currently KNOF, and it was actually founded as KNOF, and originally, Grace Adams was the lady who owned it up near the end of her life. Her husband, I'm sorry, I don't remember her husband's name, Mr. Adams, started it, and it was a kind of a gospel preaching and teaching station. And they had a lot of short form programs, and at the time I remember it, they didn't have a lot of music, and it was kind of I don't know if I want to say less desirable necessarily, but in a rating sense, at least, it was a less desirable programming. Other stations had the more national ministries, a certain sound, a certain programming, but KNOF, so KNOF was actually donated by Grace Adams before her death to North Central University in Minneapolis, a Christian university, and they actually ended up contracting with some people out of southwestern Minnesota, the same people who now own the station. But that station, the people, it's called Praise Live, it was called Praise FM, focused to a Christian music. It was similar to what KTIS plays, but just a slightly different variation. Maybe more selection. It's been a while since I've listened to that particular station, being down here, and I don't go up to Minnesota as much as I maybe would like to. But so they decided, you know what, we're over leveraged. We paid way too much for this station, and we got this loan, and we don't think we're using our resources the way God would best approve. So they sold the station to basically the Minnesota Twins. The Pohlad family, who owns the Twins, had formed a broadcast company, and we'll get to 96.3 soon. That station, 95.3, the Pohlads bought and basically paid off all of the debt, and then they made a deal where KNOF could continue with their Praise FM format that was also in southern Minnesota on HD2 of their sister station 96.3. So it was 96.3 HD2. And eventually the Pohlads sold their stations because they just weren't making money, they weren't getting the ratings, etc. And the Educational Media Foundation, aka K-Love and Air One, bought 95.3 and 96.3, and they made a deal to sell 95.3 back to this Praise FM group for a considerably lower amount of money, and they were able to raise the money and basically had almost no loan in order to buy it. I think they bought it for cash, basically. So, I mean, it was really a God-working type of thing. Now, I've talked before that I do like some Christian music and some Christian movies, but does it really reach the masses? And if you look at the ratings of KTIS FM, which is Life 98.5, you might say it does. But in the big picture, generally speaking, it doesn't. So there's a lot of Christian content on the radio, and oftentimes it's listener supported and nonprofit and whatnot, which is fine. I say if there's enough frequencies, enough people are willing to listen to it and either buy from the advertisers and the advertisers keep going, or they support the station through a fund drive, whatever, I'm all for the free market. So 95.9 was the call letters are still WLKX. And it started out as a rim shot country station from Forest Lake, Minnesota. Now the problem is there's also a 95.9 in Faribault. And you're from Minnesota if you say Faribault and not Faribault. Because the French spelling is Faribault. But in English it looks like Faribault. A little interesting trivia. So basically 95.9 served Forest Lake and the northern metro area. And it was country. For a while it flipped to a Christian music station and actually Marriage Builders. The nationally syndicated show, let's just say. Because Marriage Builders did, in a way, start on AM 980 KKMS as Marriage Talk with Bill Harley. But they went over to 95.9, which was owned by the Peters family at the time, and they basically made an arrangement to get some broadcast time and did their show. And so right now, so they did Christian contemporary for a while, and it was some classic hits, oldies type of format, and then they tried this classic rock type of format for a while, and now it's back to country. It's a sister station of Bob FM, and we talked a little bit about Bob FM and 100.3 and how the Bob Network, which plays variety hits or adult hits, was inspired by the original Bob FM 100.3. Well, anyway, so 95.9 in the north in Forest Lake, WLKX, short for Lakes Country, is now part of the Bob FM network in Minnesota, which is country in Minnesota. Nothing to do with the national Bob FM thing, other than a name correlation. So 96.3. That station started out in the far western Twin Cities, serving, I believe it was Wright County out in the western, it was out like near Hutchinson and whatnot. And they got an upgrade to move that station closer to the Twin Cities, and it became a Twin Cities station. Now, it was called KARP, carp, like the fish. And it played a mix of country and rock, and it was kind of a more country, but it was kind of an all over the board community station. But when they moved it into the Twin Cities and they sold it to the Polads, actually the Polads didn't buy it originally. A company called Radio One did. And there's another company that was before that, and that lineup but it was basically an urban, they went to the urban alternative, or not urban alternative, but the kind of the rap, hip-hop, rhythm and blues type of format, basically Black Top 40, and maybe that's not appropriate to say anymore these days, but there's no disrespect intended, it's just that was the type of music they played. That was not as commercially successful. KDWB was more successful. They took out a lot of competitors over the years. But that was KTTB for many years. And then eventually when the Polads, the twins, bought it, the station became kind of a AAA format, adult alternative, and they experimented with some different things. And it went through some format tweaks on exactly what it played, and they tried live and local, but they just couldn't get enough audience share. So like I said, they eventually sold it, and currently 96.3 is, so like I said, it was K-Twin for a while, and then it was B96, K-Twin, and then Go 96.3, the alternative station, until it sold out to Educational Media Foundation, and it is now Air 1 worship music, Christian worship music, and the next station on the dial of the big FMs, I'm going to skip all the little the translators for now, is 97.1. The city's 97. It used to also own AM 690. And they had jazz on 690 for many years. And the original that was KTCJ, and then KTCZ was 97.1 after they broke off and did their own programming. And around the 80s or so, they went to what's called AAA, which is similar to Hot AC, which I described earlier with KS95, but the adult alternative, or AAA, is even a bigger selection of music, and it kind of crosses over more into like the classic hits, the classic rock, the alternative, but still for more of a mainstream audience. And they actually did pretty good, and that's part of the reason why KQ did some of their moves, is they were getting competition from the City's 97. But back in the mid 80s, they switched to that. So just for the sake of time, I won't go too much into that. But 690 was a sports station for many years, and then Clear Channel donated it to a group that helps minorities get radio stations, and it's now a Hmong formatted station, one of two in the Twin Cities actually. And that's interesting because Minnesota, the Twin Cities, is one of the few spots in the country with a big population of Hmong. So 97.5 was technically a Rochester station, but they did a pretty good job at defending their frequency for many years, and that was an easy listening station. And they switched eventually when they sold out to more of a classic hits format, and I'm not sure it's still classic hits now. They tried a hot AC kind of format, but when the company that owned it sold it to yet another company, they switched it to a classic hits. And I believe it's still called Minnesota 97.5. Although there is now, I believe, KTIS has a translator on that frequency. They have a few different frequencies, but so that was kind of a quasi Twin Cities station for a while. 97.9 was a St. Cloud station that would periodically come in. 98.1 was a St. Cloud station. 97.9, that was not a Twin Cities station. So there was kind of this big gap between 97.1 and 98.5, where normally there could have been another full power Twin Cities station, but just because of the nature of St. Cloud, Rochester, Mankato, you got the lake country where, like Rice Lake and whatnot are, there's a lot of demand for frequencies, and the other stations popped up in other places. So 98.5, KTIS, They also own AM 900 KTIS. The AM station has Christian talk and teaching. Billy Graham, the evangelist, originally from North Carolina, and towards the end of his life he moved back to North Carolina. But he lived in Minneapolis, or in Minnesota, and he was actually the president of what's now called Northwestern University St. Paul. At the time was Northwestern College, and he was the president of it early in his career, and his ministry was actually based out of Minneapolis for a long time. So that station gets a lot of ratings. It's been very successful, I think partly because there is no what's called AC station, unlike Hot AC, which focuses a little more top 40, a little more newish. AC is generally a little lighter and older skewing, and WLTE used to do that, but that station, like I talked about in another video, switched to country, which it still is today. But so KTIS, they do good in ratings. It's Christian contemporary, all live and local DJs, so I think that's part of why they're successful. There's another gap from 98.5 to 99.5, and historically that was WLOL. Now, interestingly, AM 1330 was also WLOL, and Minnesota Public Radio, when it first came out as St. Cloud and became Minnesota Public Radio back in the 60s, they bought 1330 for their first station. Eventually they got FM 91.1 on the air, and it was both were called KSJN. And then they switched the music, the classical music, over to 99.5 when they bought the FM WLOL years later. Now there's almost a scandal, if you will, when that occurred, but so WLOL was a very big contender in the top 40 business, but it just got to the point where the company that owned it needed to sell, and the only way they could keep the company afloat and out of bankruptcy was to sell their top performing stations. So WLOL was very successful, but KDWB won the race because WDGY, AM 1130 WDGY was very successful. KDWB eventually overtook it, especially when it moved to FM, and WDGY never did. WLO, a few other competitors, including that B96 I mentioned, popped up here and there, but for the most part, it was WDGY competing with KDWB. Eventually WDGY switched to country, and then eventually to other programming. And WDGY, the callers are still in use, but at a different station, and that gets a little confusing to keep track of. But so 99.5 WLOL, and then next is 100.3, and that was actually WLOL for a while. And one of the things that fascinates me about that station is I remember, I think it was the summer of like 93, so I would have been going into my junior year. I was already very interested in radio, and I already kind of had the idea of a comedy station and some of the stuff I wanted to do. But 100.3 was for many years, and I did kind of talk about this on the last video, but was owned by the Central Theological Society and played very old-fashioned Christian music. And WCTS can still be heard on AM 1030, but they sold FM stations so they could build a new campus out in Plymouth, away from downtown Minneapolis, which was getting to be a bit of a bad neighborhood back in the day. Sorry, windows are open and the flies want to say hello. But so 100.3, they did this temporary like comedy format. So they did some funny songs and told some jokes, and then they were inviting the listeners to call and say, hey, what would you like the next format to be? Now, it ended up being, like I told you, Bob FM, WBOB, but country. But at the time, there's so many country stations in the Twin Cities market, everybody basically said anything but country. And well, I think the owners already had country in mind, so they did it anyways. They were the same people who owned, at the time, 107.9, which was and still is Cool 108. So that company started out and they did their country. Eventually, when Clear Channel got involved, which is what is now iHeartMedia, there's national consolidation all across the board from really 96 on, when the law changed, the Telecommunications Act of 96. But so Clear Channel ended up with both K102 and Bob FM 100.3. So they flipped it to Howard Stern, and like I talked about with the 105s, that had an impact on what Disney did with 92, 93, and 105. Well, 100.3 eventually dropped Howard Stern, and they dropped the hard rock, and they became WLOL, Classic Hits 100. And I actually like that station because it played a good mix of music that I remember from earlier days of growing up. And but ratings is always a thing, and then also what trends are happening. So eventually it switched to smooth jazz, and it was smooth jazz for a few years. And then the only thing that really killed smooth jazz, which had good ratings at that time, was the fact that Clear Channel nationally was moving more of their AM stations, their talk stations, to FM. And in the Twin Cities, basically they owned KDWB, which was doing pretty good. They owned the Cities 97, which was doing pretty good. They owned K102, which was doing very good. And they owned Cool 108, which was doing better than it had been, but still not the best, not what it's doing today. But their fifth FM frequency, not counting translators, was 100.3 smooth jazz, KJZI, and that station became KTLK FM, an FM talk station. Now, later on, they switched the talk format of 100.3, and because of that, AM 1500 was doing talk for many years. That's where Rush used to be, but Clear Channel owned the rights to Beck, Rush, and Hannity. So KSTP ultimately became a sports talk station on AM 1500. And so 100.3, now 1130 was a successful sports talk station, and it's actually syndicated across Minnesota and even into the Dakotas, Wisconsin, and maybe Iowa. Certainly some of the stations in southern Minnesota reach Iowa. I'm not sure exactly how big the KFan network is, but basically from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. they produce all live and local programming, and they get some pretty good ratings. And then they have Fox Sports basically the rest of the time, and games and whatnot. And partly because, excuse me, of the Vikings, they continue to get good ratings. The local talk plus the Vikings and some other sports, the Timberwolves, etc. So you had that. So now it's KFan or KFXN, because KFan FM is used, those call letters, in Texas, and they won't sell the call letters for FM, just for the AM side. So they moved the KFan call letters down to Rochester on one of their affiliates there, and they took the KFXN from the AM 690, and that's what 100.3's actual call letters are. The sorry, trying to clear my throat, and I know this video is getting long, but so 101.3 KDWB is the next major FM station, and that for many years, or I shouldn't say many years, but it had been a host of different things, and they did like a freeform type of thing. A lot of stations did kind of a freeform, independent, whatever goes type of format. 92.5, what became KQRS, did. Other stations did something similar before FM was, commercially viable. But so 101.3 Super U100, like I talked about, owned AM 980 and FM 100.3. Eventually, they sold off 100.3, and the company that owned AM 630 bought KDWB. They did some separate programming on the AM station and the FM station. They eventually moved the top 40 over to FM back in the 80s, and the AM station went off the air for a while. A new owner got it back on the air, and it was it actually took the call letters of WDGY. That 1130 WDGY was now KFAN, and they did some oldies, they did some talk, they experimented with a few different formats on WDGY 630, but that, and by the way, 740 is now WDGY, and that station is actually doing pretty good because they got FM translators, etc. So now 101.3 became top 40 KDWB back in the 80s, and it's been, the whole top 40 has kind of declined, and KSTP-FM, or KS95 as it's known, does better than KDWB. So it's not the powerhouse it used to be, but it's still a pretty popular station overall. 102.1 K102, that's also owned by Clear Channel. KEEY, they actually were a beautiful music station. Now, if you think of easy listening, beautiful music is actually slower and lighter than easy listening. If you got, like, say, a satellite radio or internet radio or whatever, basically like the satellite radio watercolors or the chill channel would be kind of the modus operandi of what the easy listening / beautiful music stations were. Smooth jazz was kind of a revisiting of that to some degree. More instrumental, easy vocals, etc. And it flipped to country back, I believe it was at 82, and they've been a powerhouse ever since. Now, back when country was popular, back around the time I graduated high school, just leading up to 95 and after, a lot of stations dallied with country. 106 became country and took the Bob FM name after 100.3 left it. And then you had 104.1 did country for a while before its current owners. A lot of changes. And I know there's other country stations and some, there's some out-of-town stations that came in. There were some AM stations that played country. So country was way overdone for a while, and that went back down. So now in the Twin Cities, it's basically K102, and the next station on the dial is 102.9. For many years, it was WCCO-FM. Now, CBS Radio, which is currently called Odyssey, which was called Intercom before they merged with CBS. They did a few different things with, because WCCO AM 830 currently is a talk station, almost exclusively live and local, and they're more of a center of the road, community interest, general interest station versus the political stuff. They might be a little more political now than they were in days gone by, but I think it's still more trying to approach a general audience than the conservative, and they get pretty good ratings. They used to play music, same as AM 1500. A lot of the AM stations that played music eventually moved to FM, and different formats came and went, etc. But so they were, at one point, they did top 40 and classic hits, and they played with different things. But they kind of found their niche with light rock or AC, adult contemporary, and they were very successful for many years. But, I think some programming mistakes were done, and some of the choices made, and just kind of the era ending where people didn't enjoy that music as much anymore. So eventually they ended up flipping it to country, which it still is today. KMNB. It was Buzzin', Buzn, Buzzin' FM, Buzzin' 1029. That was like a branding thing. And then now it's the Wolf. They went with a little more classic country, bigger playlist to try and compete better with K102. Oh, and then of course 106 is still country. We're getting to that though. So that was a story there. So next, 1041. We talked about that. They were at one point, they did some alternative. Before that, they did some disco. They did both country and classic country. They were an 80s channel for a while. The most successful thing they've done, and that has lasted the longest, is Jack FM. And that continues on 104.1 KZJK. So there's another kind of gap. There's a St. Cloud station on 104.7, which means there's not much options for Twin Cities full power stations. 105.1 is a fairly new station in the scheme of things. 105.1 started as WTCX, and they were trying to be a kind of a top, I don't know about top 40, but adult AC maybe station serving the South Metro. And 105.3 was about the same time, a little older, signed on, and they took the call letters WLOL, which currently sit on AM 1330 again, and it's a Catholic station currently. AM 1330 WLOL, Catholic programming from relevant radio. But so 105.3 served the North Metro, and then 105.7 was a newer yet station, and that was serving the West Metro. So there's 3 stations, and 105.7 was called The Cafe, and they had programming that was more kind of the soft AC, easy listening type of programming, maybe even bordering on smooth jazz. But the problem is none of those stations really lasted for long because it was hard to compete in the market. And this is a recurring thing that, you keep hearing with TV and radio. It was hard to compete. And I don't know if I'm going to do any better with some of my ideas, but I certainly would like to try, and I'd like to see more small businesses owning radio and TV stations and being competitive. But, so, and then they, like we talked about in the last video, were bought up by Cargill Communications. Cargill flipped all 3 frequencies to Rev 105, an alternative station, kind of a groundbreaking alternative station from what I hear. I mean, I did listen to it a little bit, but I really wasn't into that type of music then, especially not their really wide playlist. So, I mean, today It is again Love 105, kind of a softer AC oldies format, but never really a big ratings getter, and I think partly because the three stations are not a real full service. The 95 or the 105.7 is the best Twin Cities signal because it broadcasts from downtown Minneapolis, and the three stations together cover pretty good, but they just never really got the ratings. And they tried a few different, including a sports format for a while, a classic R&B format for a while. So 106.1 is actually a station that was originally licensed to Princeton, has WQPM. WQPM also owns AM 1300, which is now just part of the Bob network, I believe. I don't think they offer any separate programming like they used to. But they moved their tower up closer to the Twin Cities and upgraded their signal. So they have a fairly good signal in the Northwest Metro and throughout the Metro, really. But there's a station at 106.3, which is WEVR. They are a soft, easy listening. So anyways, so Bob FM, they were a country station most of their existence. They were actually planning to flip to something called Alice, but when the Point on 104.1 came into existence, it was basically the same type of thing that the Alice FM frequency was about and still exists in other markets. So they ended up not doing it, and they just went in on country. They also own 105.5 out in Albany, which is west of St. Cloud. They own 107.5 in Faribault, which is, south of the Twin Cities, and that covers the South Twin Cities fairly well, except there is a translator in Minneapolis, a low power translator that does affect its signal strength for the rest of the station, for the rest of the area. But that simulcasts 105.5 simulcasts and 95.9 simulcasts. So it kind of like the Love FM frequency, the Love 105. Well, Bob does a similar thing, but their numbers are more all over the place. All right, so now moving on. 107.1 was originally in western Wisconsin, serving New Richmond. The Hubbards, the people who own KSTP, bought that station and moved it into the Twin Cities. And it's a little harder to move a station into a big metro area now than it used to be. Not impossible, but the FCC considers how will a community be affected by losing its main signal, etc. But that was country, classic country, primarily for as long as I can remember. But then it was switched to FM Talk. And the FM Talk, they kind of tried a few different things. The idea was to be focused towards women and not necessarily political. Because keep in mind, AM 1500 was conservative talk, more mainstream. So they're trying to expand their talk reach with other programming. And some of those initial programs were good, but then they kind of became more pop culture and celebrity gossip and whatnot, and that really wasn't for me. I mean, the station still doesn't do bad. So, and a little factor, the Ole and Emma show, the radio station and the story, the fake radio station, is partly inspired by 107 dropping its country format and moving into the Twin Cities and going with talk and whatnot. And kind of Bob 106 plays into that. But, well, last but not least on the commercial FM dial is FM 107.9 Cool 108. Currently an oldies-based station or classic hits that plays primarily 80s and 90s music. Originally, when it flipped to oldies back in the late 80s, early 90s, it was focused on the 50s and 60s. But gradually, as time moves on, the oldies stations tend to move on and start dropping older music and playing newer music. And that's what Cool 108's done. They've been head-to-head competitors and even beat out KQRS, which was a #1 station for quite a while, or at least #2, #3. So probably a super long video, but that's Twin Cities radio history.